people don't realize this. The city of Philadelphia was like 5 or 6 blocks wide. The leading members of the Philadelphia City Council literally didn't know what was on the other side of the Susquehanna. And we think that it was always a city. But in 1722, it's a few blocks wide, and they literally don't know, is there a road on the other side of the Susquehanna? And yes, in fact, there is. But it's one that was created by Indigenous people.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation, in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities.
Hey everyone, Mitch Teich here. It's a holiday week, and I'm recovering from a little ankle boo-boo. And so we're going to dip into the archives for today's episode of Northwards. Cue the flashback sound effects. Just over 3 centuries ago, in 1722, an indigenous man named Sawataeny was killed in a dispute with 2 Pennsylvania settlers he considered friends. While the details of the killing were disputed or interpreted differently by witnesses, it occurred at a time when relations between the British colonies and the indigenous nations were at a precarious point. The investigation into the case was filled with twists and turns and complex characters who could easily have been the stuff of an Agatha Christie murder mystery. But it really happened. And a couple of years ago, a book, a nonfiction book, about the case won the Pulitzer Prize for History. It tells the story of Sawateny's murder and also lays out why the case is important today. The author is Nicole Eustace, and she has some long ties to the North Country. Eustace joined us on the line back in 2022. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
The events you describe in this book took place 300 years ago, and much of what it covers had nearly been forgotten until you wrote this book. How did you learn about the death of Sawataeny, and why did it spark the extensive research that led to this book?
I was interested in thinking about histories of colonial contact between settler colonists and indigenous peoples of North America. And I was interested in colonial narratives about their own civility. And I have a lot of prior experience and research in 18th century Pennsylvania. And I knew that by the 1760s, there was going to basically be something that we could call a race war in Pennsylvania. There was something called the Paxton Riots, where the last surviving members of a peaceful Christianized indigenous community at Conestoga were massacred, every one of them. And the vigilantes who did this faced no legal consequences as a result of their actions. And this was right before the American Revolution. So I knew that's where we were heading, and yet we all know that Pennsylvania is supposed to be the peaceable kingdom. So I started off kind of really wanting to get my head around, how do you get from the peaceable kingdom to this horrendous massacre? And what are the sort of confrontations that happen? And so I just started reading Pennsylvania records beginning in 1718, which was the year that William Penn died. And lo and behold, I came across this murder case. And then I came across the native spokesperson from the Susquehanna Valley region, the community of Conestoga. And he was a man called Captain Civility. And that, of course, turned everything inside out in terms of European assumptions about who was civilized and who was savage. And it turns out that Captain Civility really schooled colonists in indigenous ideas about justice as they were trying to resolve the crisis of Sawateny's death.
Well, and so with that in mind, what was the relationship between the Pennsylvania colony, and I guess the colonies as a whole, and especially the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee at the time?
So at the time, the English refer to them as the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, and that's because the Tuscarora actually traditionally are understood to have joined the League in 1722. So all my sources call them the 5 nations, and I refer to them as that as well. In this period, the northeastern woodlands are very much Haudenosaunee territory, from the Hudson Valley region all the way to the Great Lakes and down into the Susquehanna River region, and over towards the Chesapeake. It's really kind of a vast range. If you look at a British map made in London in 1722, the map labels the entire region Iroquois. And so this is the way that Europeans understood the geopolitical landscape of North America. And so we might be thinking in our minds about colonial divisions and colonial maps and European map makers' lines. But the reality on the ground was that there were diverse, dispersed Native peoples. This is native ground, as the historian Kathleen Duval has called it, which is just a lovely phrase.
But that did not necessarily stop the colonists, especially kind of elite colonists, from staking claims to many of these lands.
Absolutely not. But in 1722, British ambition far outstripped the actual conditions on the ground. People don't realize this. The city of Philadelphia was like 5 or 6 blocks wide. The leading members of the Philadelphia City Council literally didn't know what was on the other side of the Susquehanna. So today, when we think of Philadelphia, it stretches river to river from the Delaware to the Susquehanna, and we see maps of William Penn's Green Country Town, and we think that it was always a city. But in 1722, it's a few blocks wide, and they literally don't know, is there a road on the other side of the Susquehanna? And yes, in fact, there is. But it's one that was created by Indigenous people.
Yeah. So one of the striking details that comes out in the inquiry into Sawateny's death is how he viewed John Cartledge, the man who killed him. He described him as a friend. Was Sawateny's use of friend the way we think of friendship today, or was he making a bigger statement?
I think that he was using it in the casual way that we would use it today, and that it was a bigger statement. So Sawateny's widow, Winnie P. Rada, reported his final words. And she said that his final words were, quote, "My friends have killed me." And Captain Civility described Sawateny to investigators from colonial Philadelphia as, quote, "a civil man, a warrior, a man of very few words." So we can guess that Sawateny himself had a role in trying to be a civil person who brought people together into community. And for Native peoples, when there was an accidental death amongst friends or allies, this was a moment for community repair and renewal. Yes, there needed to be economic restitution. Yes, there needed to be spiritual and emotional amends. But it wasn't a moment for declaring war and seeking vengeance, nor was it a moment for identifying an individual criminal and trying to hand down a heavy punishment that would just land on the back of the perpetrator. This was a moment for people to come together and renew ties. So we can't know for sure if that's really what Sawateny said, but we can know that his wife and the other surviving leaders of his community chose to communicate that to the settler colonists as a signal of how they wanted to proceed in the case.
William Keith was the governor at the time, and the thread that I think comes out in your narrative is that he keeps shifting what his objectives are in resolving the case. What are the political issues that he's dealing with, albeit sometimes poorly, and how do they relate to his personal aims?
So William Keith is a new governor. He arrives after the death of William Penn, and he was appointed by William Penn's widow, William Penn's second wife, who was Anglican, and he was Anglican as well. So he did not really share any of the kind of pacifist philosophers of the Quakers. And he thought that William Penn had been much too lenient in the way that he had been administering the colony. So one of the first things that Keith did when he arrived was push through a harsh new penal code that vastly expanded the number of crimes that would be subjected to capital punishment, including manslaughter. So not just murder, but manslaughter could be considered a capital crime. And he did that because he really kind of wanted to be the law and order governor. And he also did it because he had a worldview that was not democratic. It is a very seigneurial worldview. He didn't necessarily intend to impose all these harsh penalties, but he wanted the power of the law in his own hands. And then he could dispense mercy in return for favors or for certain favorite people. And so he had this sort of patronage model of justice in his mind. That was potentially much harsher and more severe and also more arbitrary than what William Penn had in mind when he created a constitution for his colony. So those are his kind of political goals, and it's very much about asserting himself against the local Quaker elite, because this guy was an aristocrat, but he was impoverished. His father died indebted, so he's got this fancy title. He's Sir Keith, baronet, but he has no money, and he really wants a manor. He wants to be the lord of the manor, literally. And in order to do that, he needs native ground. He needs to get land from native people. So first and foremost, he wants to tamp down any potential for violence in the colony so that he can create the manor he's imagining, that he's planning to call Fountainlow, and build himself a big, impressive manor house and show the local Quakers that he's really the top guy.
At the same time, the fact that this guy, John Cartledge, is accused of murder or even manslaughter is a pretty complicated problem for him.
Absolutely. And he has to figure out kind of how to thread his way through making good on his harsh new legal code while also not necessarily killing one of his colonists. And the thing that was fascinating about researching this book was the number of plot twists. It felt like I was reading a novel, just reading the sources, and I tried to convey that feeling for my readers in turn. John Cartledge was not just a fur trader. He was also a justice of the peace, and he was also a land surveyor. And John Cartledge was also an ambitious guy on his way up, or so he hoped. And he thought he had maybe found some mineral deposits, maybe silver, maybe iron. And so when he was sprung from jail on bail, the first thing he did was tell Governor Keith, hey, I can show you where you can make a fortune in mining. And so Keith literally goes riding into the Pennsylvania countryside, accompanied by this accused murderer, out on bail to hold a conference with the indigenous people of the Conestoga region to see if they would be okay if he claims land in their community. And John Cartledge translates the governor's apology for the murder as if he is not himself the accused murderer. The mind boggles. It's really, it's just so dramatic.
Suffice it to say, William Keith doesn't necessarily really seem to understand much about the indigenous people with whom he's dealing, most of the time anyway. What are the fundamental issues he really doesn't appreciate when it comes to the attitudes of the indigenous people and justice?
Well, this is the really fascinating thing. So as he's trying to avoid actually doing anything to John Cartledge, one of his dodges is to say, well, I'm not totally sure that anybody was murdered. I haven't seen the body myself. Maybe he's not dead. And when he hears from Captain Civility that people at Conestoga are not interested in seeing John Cartledge incarcerated long-term, much less subjected to capital punishment, it's almost too good to be true. So he's let's send an emissary to the leaders of the Five Nations near Albany and find out, like, okay, this powerful confederacy, what's their take? So another man who is said to be from the Cayuga Nation named Sachichoa undertakes the mission to go and rendezvous with leaders of the Haudenosaunee and figure out how they're kind of taking in these events. When Sachichoa comes back, he tries to school the governor in indigenous perspectives on justice. And he literally tells the governor, one life is enough to be lost. There should not two die for this. He explains that the leaders of the Haudenosaunee in the Albany region expect a formal visit of condolence from the governor of Pennsylvania. They expect him to come and pay ritual respects to Sawataeny and his community and the larger League of the Haudenosaunee. They expect him to arrive bearing gifts, we would call them reparations. They want significant economic compensation for this loss. And they want the governor to apologize. But once he has gone through this kind of tripartite spiritual, emotional, and material process of repair, then they would like for John Cartledge and his brother, who was his co-conspirator, to be freed and allowed to return to the community. And the governor doesn't want to. He says that it's a very long trip. He doesn't want to go. He tells the council we have to find the cheapest way to satisfy them. He really does not want to play along, but he doesn't have a lot of choice. And in this incredibly symbolic and dramatic moment, Sachi Choa takes a string of wampum, which is a kind of the sort of diplomatic gift that you would usually bring to an official communique. He takes the string of wampum and he wraps it around the governor's arm as if he's taking him captive and gestures pulling the governor to Albany. And in fact, the Haudenosaunee were successful. Keith did go in a horse train to Albany, and he duly observes all of the ritual forms demanded of him. And then in Albany in 1722, they signed a treaty. And the treaty recounts the perspectives of the Haudenosaunee and all of the rituals that they went through. And that treaty is the oldest continuously recognized treaty in Anglo-American law. It's still in effect today. And so the final kind of overarching argument that I try to make in the book is lots of us have forgotten about it, but this is one of our nation's founding documents. And this is a resource that we could return to. We could actually re-engage with some of these principles of justice and use them to try to find better solutions to our current problems.
Nicole Eustace is the author of Covered with Night, a story of murder and Indigenous justice in early America. Eustace is a professor of history at NYU and has long family ties to the Adirondacks. Covered with Night won the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for History, and Eustace joined us then. That's all for this edition of Northwards. Ethan Shanty tells us the names of the people who make this show possible every week.
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, edited, and produced by Mitch Tyke with digital production supervision by me, Ethan Shanty. Caitlin Kelly handles our social media, Bill Hanel is our digital director, and Doyle Dean is our production manager. Music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. To support this show and find more podcasts, visit ncpr.org. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.